I am so deeply grateful that you would take out time from your busy, busy life. I know it is. And come here to be together. All of us going 90 different directions and trying to live the Christian life, and yet here we are for one little moment in time to be together. And I'm just honored and grateful for your presence and glad that we have this occasion together. I feel a great responsibility to try to say something that will be of encouragement to you, strengthen you, help you to be more determined and more faithful in what you're doing for the Lord. So I tried to put together a few thoughts over the last few weeks that I thought may be helpful to you. Let's hope so. There's so much, of course, about this subject that we're not going to talk about, like qualifications and things along that line. If we have a little time toward the end, I'd be happy to try to respond to any questions or thoughts that you might want to express. But I thought we would spend most of our time just on the concept of what it means to be an elder. What are elders supposed to do? Why did God assign elders in His church? What is this important responsibility, this function that occurs? And you're familiar with all of these. Each one comes right out of passages of Scripture. But one of these, of course, is the idea of knowing the sheep. And you know that that's true. But when you get down to looking at this, what all is involved in that? What do you mean know the sheep? Know them in the sense of they come through the church building door, you know them, you say their name, you shake their hand. Okay, I know them. Or is it more than that? Is there some type of closeness and intimacy that elders ought to possess toward every one of the sheep? And you know that John 10, of course, is a great passage where Jesus discusses the principle of shepherds and sheep with the intention of applying that, of course, spiritually. He's not really talking about, the animals. He's talking about the relationships, especially his, to his sheep. But he comments on the fact that they hear his voice, and he calls them by name and leads them out. So, you see a flock of sheep out there as you drive by in your car, and you don't think anything of it. Okay, there's a flock of sheep, but the shepherd, the one that's assigned to ownership or the regulation, the handling, the treatment of that flock, he knows each one of them by name. There's a more intimate connection. He has a closer relationship. He's been so involved in their lives that they feel familiar with him. Think about that. How close do the members of the congregation where you shepherd, how close do they feel to you, let alone how close you feel to them? Have you established a relationship with them in such a way that they are on a more intimate level with you in their closeness, their familiarity with you, their awareness of you, to what extent they know you? Dropping down to verse 4, when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Think of the implications of that. And not merely that if they were to close their eyes and hear 5 people speak out, they would recognize your voice. I don't think that's what he's talking about. It may be with the sheep. He's talking about they have a depth of familiarity with him, that they're acquainted with him. They know him. And they have a closeness. They're so comfortable with him and trusting of him that they follow him. They have confidence in him. They know him that well. They know who he is, what he's made of. I think these are the kinds of things that Jesus is driving at. So, here are some soul-searching questions that we ought to ask ourselves and think about when we think about the responsibility that we have. How well do I know every member? I mean, know. So, here's a family that's are members of the congregation. You know how many children they have. What do you know about those children? What do you know about the couple, the adults? What's going on in their lives? Where does he work? Where does she work? Or whatever. Just the details of who they are. How well do you know every single member of the congregation? And how close are you to them? How would you describe your relationship with them in terms of closeness, familiarity, awareness of who they are and they being aware of who you are? Aren't these the kinds of things that these passages are talking about? How much do I know about the spiritual condition? Now, see, that's really the tough thing. Well, do I know, when they were married? That would be nice to know, but, and I think the more familiar an elder becomes with a couple, the more those kinds of things will come out. But really, what the Bible's driving at is how connected are you to their spiritual condition? Where are they spiritually? How strong are they? Are they faltering in some aspect of their life that pertains to their moral and spiritual condition? It's clear to me that God wants elders to serve as that go-between between himself and the sheep. They are to do the bidding of God by being connected with those people, knowing their condition, and then doing for them what God wants done for them. That makes the role of the elder unbelievably critical. Well, how then do you achieve that level of intimacy? Well, you have to be with them. You have to get with them and see how they're doing. And, over the years, I've noticed elders trying to do this in different ways, dividing up the church directory and visiting them maybe two at a time or whatever, two elders together. There's a lot of practical ways to do that, but the point is that it needs to be done. You've got to find out how they're doing. How many times have you known of situations where just out of the blue, for example, a couple gets divorced and takes everybody unawares? Well, that didn't just happen suddenly. There were circumstances in their lives leading up to that. Those are the kinds of things that elders have to be privy to, they have to be on top of, they have to be aware of. So how would you know? How would you find that out? Because people are going to be closed about that sort of thing, and you go over to their house, knock on the door, go in and sit down and chat with them. They're not going to just, oh, by the way, we got a lot of things going on in our marriage and we're probably going to divorce. They're not going to come out with that. So what can elders do to try to anticipate rather than wait till it's already coming to fruition? I believe those are the kinds of things God wants elders to think about and formulate strategies to try to anticipate and prevent as much of that sort of thing as possible. You see, just having a few moments in the church building every Sunday, not going to get that done. It's just not. That's not really where we get to know each other, is it? I mean, the assembly has a lot of things about it that God intends to serve very important purposes, but I don't think achieving a depth of awareness of each other is going to happen in that short time. Even if you go 3 times a week, you're diligent about that. I'm sure there are assemblies that you come to where you don't even talk to everybody. There's no way for you to talk to everybody, every assembly. So that's just not going to be the realm in which this kind of thing is achieved. So how do you achieve it? Well, we've got to think of ways by which we can do that. And notice that when we look back from eternity, I just wonder if this COVID situation is going to be viewed as not in terms of all the things that are happening in our country with regard to it, but it was Satan's attack on the church. Well, not the country, the church. We know Satan is operative, walking about. He wants to hurt the church. He doesn't have to hurt anybody else. He's got them. So that's just, collateral damage, I guess. But looking back from eternity, what's going to be the impact of COVID on the Church of Christ? And as elders, elders must look at that and say, okay, we need to take steps to not let this thing damage the overall spiritual condition of the church. Well, you don't think that this separation is doing that? It is. Here we were hit with this thing. Probably in our lifetime, none of us have really had anything like this to face in terms of, okay, can we meet or not? And I think the church was reeling there for the first few weeks, and we went along with all the expectations of government. Look what's happening there. We've lived in a society that has been free to pursue Christianity without governmental interference. See, that's changing. That is changing. And I think we realized the need there initially to separate, but then as more things that, now looking back over a year later, come on. Shouldn't we have taken the attitude of the government has no right to impose anything on us. They ought to investigate, research, and inform us. It irritated me all the way back in the 60s when, I was a kid, but I remember when they came out with the law, you got to wear a seatbelt. That's mandated. A policeman stops you, even today, you'll get a ticket. Well, it's one thing to tell people, hey, we've done all the research and the stats show that if you wear seatbelts, you're more likely to survive a crash. Okay, that's fine. But you don't have any right to come and tell me I've got to do that. That is a true infringement upon freedom. So, from a Christian perspective, we must be allowed to pursue what we think is necessary in order to be pleasing to God. And what we've done is, I believe, we've left the impression with a large segment of the church that, having church via Zoom is really not that much different than actually being there. And I think we were struggling with that concept early on. But it's logical for people to conclude, well, if we can worship back last April through the internet, well, then why can't we keep doing that? And that's caused us to step back and say, wait a minute. The biblical doctrine of the assembly of the church. I realize they didn't have that technology available 2,000 years ago, but that doesn't matter. The concept, they're not equal concepts. The very idea of members coming together in physical space and touching each other and shaking hands and hugging and being with each other. You can't replace that dynamic electronically. The statements that are used in scriptures, like in 1 Corinthians, is when you come together. That's not talking about some sort of long distance connection over lines. That's talking about being in each other's physical presence. So we're at a point now in the country where the church needs to step back and say, wait a minute here. I've also been a little bit surprised at our brethren being so frightened by death. That's typical of the world, but not the church. We preach and teach and believe constantly that this world is not our home. We're just passing through here, and we don't really fear, if my wife dies tomorrow from her COPD or whatever, obviously I will grieve deeply. But that we as Christians have anticipated that, we've been preparing for that, so we'll go through the heartache and then keep moving toward eternity. So why are we scared to death? We're scared to death of death. That's not the Christian perspective. Even Paul even said there in 1 Thessalonians that even at a funeral, Christians don't grieve the way everybody else does. Okay, then there is a difference. We don't grieve like people who have no hope. So when you start weighing, well, we don't want to get the virus, but neither do I want to check out of my Christianity, then which one are you going to pick? Well, you may not agree with any of that, but I think we need to This is making the role of elders much more difficult. How are you going to shepherd people that are staying at home and tuning in on the internet? How are you going to do that? Okay, so once again, the Bible teaches, do we obey God or men? Whatever needs to be done to facilitate the role of shepherding, even if that overrides what the government's telling you to do, you got a choice to make. And I think we're doing everything we can to avoid persecution. We read in the Bible about persecution and how the Christians were mistreated by the government, and we're more likely than to side with the government and not subject ourselves to that. Well, I don't have all the answers to that, but it seems to me now after a full year, this has been misrepresented to us. And there's not any other illness that has taken a lot of lives. And we've had a number of illnesses in our country that have taken a lot of lives. And none of them were treated this way by the government or by rank and file Americans. So something's going on right now, and I believe a lot of it is an attack by Satan to hurt the church. And of all the people in this society, it ought to be Christians and especially elders that are savvy enough to not just be herded along with the masses like animals. That's what government does to people. Instead of each one of us standing up and thinking for ourselves based on the Bible, and then doing what we need to do, even if it brings us up against opposition from the government itself. We must obey God rather than men, Acts 5. And so here would be one practical application, and I'm sure you've even done this. Divide up the directory, call, visit, check on members. And again, see, that has to be more than simply, hey, how are you all doing? Everything okay with you? Well, we're here, we're thinking about you. If you need us, let us know. It can't be that. Because people that are in a crisis, spiritual crisis, are probably going to clam up, and they're not going to alert you efficiently to their circumstances and their desperate need for shepherding. So it's up to elders to probe and suffer the consequences of that as well, by the way. So investigate where members are in their thinking given our cultural circumstances. What about that? There are things that we're facing now in the church beyond this virus thing that is culturally pressing. And I realize we don't get involved in politics. I realize that. However, when politics begins to infringe upon spiritual and moral things, then we've got to address that. And we're going to be accused of getting into politics, even by our own brethren. But the fact that moral and spiritual issues are politicized doesn't suddenly mean that those issues are to be taken out of the spiritual realm and turned over to the government or something. We can't fall for that. Christians don't view life that way. You know that seminar on the silencing of God that I do years ago? I went to a congregation and there was a couple sitting right close to the front pew, and they had not been there Friday or Saturday to hear kind of the build-up, but it so happens on Sunday morning that I reached the point where I talk about abortion and how the Bible is cut and dried on that. I mean, it's clear where the Bible is on that. And I, make the point that this has become a political issue, even defining, different parties and stuff. And my point is, man, that's all irrelevant. I want to know God's view on abortion, and then I'm going to stand on that view. Well, I didn't get very far into that. I mean, just barely. And this couple got up and left, which, by the way, is not unusual when I preach. But I asked the preacher after, I said, did something happen? Were they called out on emergency? Oh, no. When they found out you were talking about abortion, they felt you were getting into politics, and they left. How can Christians think that way? I don't care what your political preferences are. That's a Bible issue. The Bible speaks definitively about that subject. And so, as Christians, we have got to help the members in shepherding them to sort through where can you hold opinions that are strictly political, and that's okay for you to do, be a part of the Lions Club or whatever, and where does that blend into and start to overlap with spiritual and moral issues for which we are given no allowance by God? We must stand with God on those things, even if it alienates us from some of our own private affiliations and preferences. Well, elders ought to help people do that. I think that's part of sorting out this thing. And so you think about that. Think of all the stuff that's gone on in our country with the racial stuff that's happening. Are we just going to keep quiet about that, not say anything? Or are we going to keep reaffirming what the Bible teaches? One of the things that irritates me about all of that is, you and I as Christians, we know that skin color is completely irrelevant. Now, it's supposed to be. I realize it's not. A lot of people have issues with that. We've had in our nation horrible things that have taken place in terms of mistreating each other, and a lot of it seems to revolve around that, the Civil War and all that stuff. But from the Christian perspective, we understand that we all look different physically, apart from the complexion of our skin, which we have every shade, do we not? But think of all the other things that we differ about in terms of our physical appearance. Eye color, hair color, size of our nose. There are all kinds of differences. And I believe the biblical view was articulated very clearly by God in 1 Samuel 15, when you remember, or it's chapter 16, where God sent Samuel to select a successor to Saul, who was being deposed by God. And he went to the home of Jesse, who had 8 sons. And when he looked over the oldest boy, military, he must have been robust, muscular, maybe shiny. When Arnold Schwarzenegger would, what do they do, these guys? They put grease or something on their skin where it shines, and that must have been how that boy looked. And Samuel thought, surely this is the anointed. This is the one God wants. God said no. And that, again, from his perspective, Samuel starts working down from the oldest to the youngest, and the next 2 boys were also in the military. So as he went to each one, he thought, surely this is the one. And God kept saying no until he got through all but the last one, and God told him no. And Samuel looked over at Jesse and said, you got any other boys? Well, there's David out there taking care of the sheep. The implication there, he's kind of the young, scrawny one of the bunch. Well, get him in here. And he literally, as he passed through the door frame, God said to Samuel, this is him. But you remember the statement that God made to Samuel when Samuel kept fixating on that physical appearance? God said, I don't look at the outside like you do. Okay, then there's biblical clarification. You and I have absolutely no right to look on the outside and make any judgments. Height, he mentions 2 physical features in that text. He doesn't mention skin color, but by implication, that's included. Okay? Now that ought to settle it. There's the Christian perspective. And we don't have to go to Galatians 3. There's neither, slave nor free, Gentile, Jew, male, female. That hits it too. And there's lots of passages that make the principle, but that one's clear. God does not look on the outside. Do you? If you want to be like God, you're not going to look at the outside and make any judgments. As ugly as Kevin might be, don't make any, and that beard, but don't make any judgments based on that. He may have been sick and not able to shave today or something. 5 months. Now, for a Christian, I believe that would settle it, see. Now, it's easy to say that and then proceed to, in your own heart, hold ill will for somebody based upon some physical feature. But that's sin. That is sin. And we must not make those judgments about each other. We must not make our decisions as Christians based on the appearance of a person. We've got to look on the heart like God does. So there's some soul-penetrating questions we ought to ask ourselves. Do I just say that I only look on the heart, or is that really what governs my life? If we cannot mirror to the world around us with all this stuff going on, and by the way, I personally do not believe that all of the turmoil that's taking place in our country is really a racial thing. That's not to say there's not a racial component to it, there is. But I don't believe that's what's happening. I believe what's happening right now in our country on a national scale is a struggle, a fight for the moral and religious complexion of our nation. This is ultimately an attack upon Christianity, and that's all. So when you hear people talking about socialism and Marxism, then you know this isn't about skin color. That's just a ruse that they're capitalizing on, they're using. This is about the soul of America in terms of our religious orientation. As poorly as many of our people may have lived up to that, I grant that. But that doesn't alter the fact that the general thrust of our nation from day one has not been Islamic, it's not been Buddhist, and it's not been atheist. It's had an overall Christian orientation, and most of our people believe the Bible's the Word of God. That's no longer the case. And so there's a move, I think, to hasten the decline of Christian principles. That's why there's increasing attacks upon churches. You know, you and I may think, well, I don't really care what happens to these denominations. They want to shut them down, go ahead. But you don't understand. This is all an attack upon Christianity, and we're next. And we may, in our lifetime, or at least our kids' lifetime, live to face real persecution like we've read about in the history books that we can't relate to. We're seeing more evidence of that now than ever before in my lifetime. So I would be shocked to think it's not coming. It's coming on. And the Church of Christ must not be divided within over such matters. We've got to hold together and stand up and represent God accurately to the world and society around us, and not have these little affiliations that mean more in my life and are stronger in my thinking than what the church is. That can't be the case. We ought to be staking our lives locked arm in arm with each other as Christians and model to the world that skin color and the like is simply not an issue with us. And if any of us have mistreated each other over that, we ought to repent and ask forgiveness and get it right, get it straight. If we can't do it now, we're going to be in trouble when we face God. My point here is, should elders be working with members to sort through and sift through some of these things that are front and center stage in society and in the media? So elders, see, rather than things happening out here in the world, we just kind of ignore it. Man, I don't want to go there. I don't want to get involved in that. No, elders have got to help sheep sort through all of that. Teach and strengthen each other in light of what's happening. I think that's important. I think God, He doesn't want us to be of the world, but we are in the world, and we've got to address what's happening and help members to think through the Christian perspective on this and not be sucked into things, which in turn weakens the church. If we're divided, we ought to be able to work together and be together. You know, I don't have any problem with there being, quote, all white churches and all black churches, but surely that's bothered us. When I was a kid, I got the impression it was more a situation of geography. You know, we were separated by distance, even like I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. But that's not really the problem now. People drive a good distance to attend a congregation. So why can we not mix more than we have been? Why don't we? What is there that's holding us? And you ought to take out a piece of paper and make a list of what that is, and then stand back and look at it and see if God accepts that. And I'm not saying, we ought to force some sort of a integration or something. I'm simply saying there ought not to be any rancor between us. We all ought to be on the same page and accept one another and be headed toward the same destination. That's all going to be erased in eternity. So we'd better erase it right now. Well, maybe here in a little bit if you want to comment on any of that. By becoming familiar with members, what's going on in their lives, with their jobs, their children, their hobbies, whatever. Then, notice, when tragedy strikes, elders already have a pre-existing relationship that has been cultivated and nurtured. That's really when members need their shepherds, when they're facing trauma of some sort, distress or stress, to help them to get through the spiritual implications of all of that. Well, if you come into that situation cold turkey, you don't really know them, they don't know you, they don't see you as being a person that they can lean on and look to and receive assistance. So that relationship has to be nurtured and established before the hard times come, or the calamity or the disturbance. Well, that takes time and effort. I know it's a hard job. I'm convinced it's the hardest job in the church. It exceeds preaching. Does it take a lot of time and effort to absorb as much Bible as you can? Yeah. But then applying that, see, there's where the real task begins, and shepherds have such an awesome responsibility because there's so many people that they are responsible for. There's the tough job in the church. Harder than being a husband or wife, I believe. Elders can fail to grasp the enormous benefit for them to get to know members, who in turn come to love and respect them. See, there's a kind of a side benefit to being an elder. You get into people's lives and you serve as a spiritual guardian and a spiritual advisor and a support system. Well, that then gives benefits to the elder that he won't get anywhere else. To know that he's helped people prepare for eternity and to get through the hardships of this life in such a way that their faith remains intact, that has got to bring to an elder a great sense of satisfaction, fulfillment. And I realize it can be very awkward to try to get into people's lives because most people don't want you meddling in their lives. Well, we Christians have got to be more receptive to one another than that. But the outcome will pay rich rewards. And, we all have different personalities. And so we vary in terms of, for example, how sociable you might be. Some people seem to have a knack for being friendly and outgoing, and others don't. I understand that, and that's okay. I think God understands the personality issue, but I do think He wants us to grow. He wants us to stretch ourselves. And so it's awkward to try to get into someone's life and relate to them and talk with them and find out how they're doing, but we can still do that. It's like my mother when she said, you need to eat your vegetables. I don't like these vegetables. She read an article in the 60s about how liver enhances your blood. And I don't know if you can make beef liver where it tastes good, but she sure couldn't. And course, I've since found out that the liver is a filter for debris and stuff in the body, so I don't understand why that would be good for you to eat. But you know what her statement was, probably yours too, the World War II generation, they all had the same statements. They must have colluded. She said, if you said you didn't like something, she said, you need to learn to like it. Well, that wasn't helpful at the time either, but I understand the principle. All of us can learn to function in situations that we don't really want to function in. It's not second nature to us. It kind of goes against us. It's scary. That's not who I am. You know, if you took that tact with your children, then you would never discipline them or do anything. Just let them be who they are and do what they want to do. Every action on the part of a parent to curtail a child's behavior is causing that child to change and grow and mature. That's the nature of discipline. Well, the Bible teaches clearly that God uses that on us all the time. Why? Well, Hebrews 12 says, for our good, so that we can be more like Him and grow and mature. That's a good thing. It's painful. Remember the illustration he gives there? When your dad gave you a whooping? There wasn't anything pleasant about that. In fact, he says it was painful. But afterwards, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. Look at that. And notice there's no shortcut to that. You got to be whipped. Well, that's what God's doing for us if we'll submit to it. In fact, He says that. You've got to yield yourself to it. You can resist it the whole time and reject it. I'm not going to. That's a rebellious child. But if you'll submit yourself to it, yield to it, it's going to alter you in ways that will improve you for eternity. And I think elders need to grow in this. They're assigned this job, and the heart and core of it is to watch for souls, so you've got to be able to get in there and scrutinize and examine that soul and see what assistance is needed. What are the leading spiritual threats of our day? Would you say this is one of them? Premarital sex. You know, the marriage institution is on hard times. It has declined. All the stats across the board show. In fact, some of these sociologists go so far as to say that the traditional marriage as we've known it, that is no longer a part of American culture. It's gone. And you see lots of evidence all around you. You know, we're kind of in an oasis in the church. And we grapple with these things and focus on them. But out here in the world, they're not. Marriage is almost meaningless to most people in American culture. So that's an issue. Look how much out of marriage sex is taking place in pregnancy. Many, many, many children growing up in fatherless homes. All of this issue we've talked about some, the virus, the overall breakdown again, the anthropologists and all these guys say that we are a post-Christian nation. That says a lot. So, what do we need to do as shepherds to be on the front lines of helping members to cope with all of this social and cultural turmoil? Deterioration, disintegration. That makes elders' jobs a lot harder. If you were an elder back in the World War II generation, I can see where most people shared the same values, the same morality. It would have been so much easier to be an elder. Even as it would have been easier to be a preacher. But that's past. And does God expect us to step up to the plate and take the heat and the consequences and the opposition that you're naturally going to encounter by simply trying to help people get to heaven? And they're not going to look at it that way. All right. Principle number 2, elders must be sacrificial. When you look at all that's involved in being a shepherd, to me, one of the big questions would be, I don't have time to do that. And then you would start thinking of all the things that's going on in your life that's eating up your time. Something's got to give. Well, apparently, God expects that to take place then. I suspect that may be one reason why elders are older. You know, the picture kind of given there in the New Testament is their children, since they have to have believing children, then those children must be old enough to be believers. So we're talking then about a person that's a little bit older and maybe has fewer responsibilities and time constraints than he did when he was younger. But in any case, yeah, it's going to take time, and that may mean not going fishing. If that's something you really love, nothing wrong with that. But you may have to cut that out. Or any other hobby or event that you enjoy doing. Cut it out in order to come up with that time that you need. My son has written a book on child rearing. And he makes the point in there that in order for a dad to do everything he needs to do to get his kids squared away and prepared for adulthood, he's going to have to cut out most all the stuff that most men do these days. Hunting, fishing, watching TV, just on and on it goes. And he just came to that conclusion because he thought through all the things that he needs to do to nurture his kids. You know, like Deuteronomy says, talk to them when you get up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, during the day, and all that. Well, you know, I remember parenting. It was more like, you know, you do what you have to do, but then you kind of, okay, now go on and do what you need to do. And so you've got to look at your life as an elder and see, now really, when I look at all the things that's going on in my life, how much of that is stuff that I could cut out so that I could be more devoted to shepherding and checking on the spiritual, monitoring the spiritual condition of the members. I suspect there's a lot of time we could cut out. Time and energy. You know, when we come home from work, we want to have cave time and kind of get away from it all, relax for a few minutes, and then maybe there's a show or two we'd like to watch on TV. Well, you don't really have to do that. You want to, the flesh presses you to do it, but we need to allow the Spirit to reassert itself and do what we need to do. So really, elders sacrifice their lives, their time, their talent, their attention. They've got to do that. They've got to deny self in order to devote themselves to the spiritual status of other people. The very nature of that role requires it. It demands it. You know, in John chapter 10, when that fellow that had been born blind from, you know, his whole life blind, never saw the light of day. And the Pharisee, you know, Jesus healed him. And man, the Jewish hierarchy, they were all over that, trying to squelch the implications of that. Well, you know, they weren't elders per se, but they were leaders. They were supposed to be contributors to the spiritual health of the nation. You think they cared about that? They did not care about the people over whom they exerted authority. That was not who they were. By the way, I get that feeling with all these politicians. Same thing. You know, by definition, politicians are supposed to be there for the people and really do the people's bidding and help the people. You think that's what they're doing? Or are they there for money, power, prestige? See, this is not new. This is 6,000 years worth of human behavior. It's no different with our own people. Their ulterior motives and interests in life superseded any concern for spiritual things. They're more concerned about establishing their own standing, their own position, their own power, and no doubt benefiting financially from it. And yet here's this fella. Now, he hadn't seen anything. We don't know how old he is, but he's of age, his parents say. Perhaps the happiest day in this man's life. He has his sight restored. And do they rejoice with him? No, they're all over him. Come on now, tell us how this came about. Were you really blind? Went to his parents. Was he really born blind? And notice how they passed the buck. Well, hey, he's of age, go talk to him. We don't want to get into it. They were afraid they were going to be sanctioned or something, you see. They weren't concerned about this man or his parents. So rather than embracing that moment and celebrating and enjoying this great moment in his life, they hassle him, go after his parents, get the whole village stirred up. You see, that's the opposite of a shepherd. They did not have a shepherd's heart. So the overall thrust of a shepherd even is not going around trying to whip everybody into shape and scolding people and rebuking them. There's times to do that, but that's not the overall thrust. Look, I got to get you to heaven, so you need to stop that and you need to do this, this, and this. We need to be more tender and heartfelt in our approach to relating to people and helping them to get to heaven. So the techniques, the strategies that elders use in their leadership. You know, this applies to preachers too. There's times for preachers to be stern, obviously, in presenting the truth, but if a preacher's in the pulpit and he really doesn't care about the people, it's just more getting to stand up there and tell people what for, well, he's going to give account for that too. And the Lord may use him to present a lot of truth, but he himself may very well lose his own soul. Verse 3 of this chapter, the sheep hear his voice. We mentioned this earlier. He calls his own sheep by name, leads them out. So involved in their lives that they're familiar with him, he's familiar with them. Verse 4, he brings out his own sheep, goes before them. The sheep follow him because they know his voice. They're so comfortable with him and so trusting of him. See, that implies a period of time that they've developed this trust. That doesn't just happen overnight or by virtue of his status. So what I'm suggesting to you is an elder has to facilitate the development of this relationship before the hard times come. And then when they come, it'll be so much easier for the elder to step in there and relate and help them to get through the struggle and the situation in a successful way. And this statement, you know, there's such self-sacrifice obviously associated with Jesus' own life. But he connects that to shepherding. Well, it's probably not likely that a shepherd's going to be called upon to literally sacrifice his physical life and die for the sheep. Not now, at least. So what's it talking about? Well, it's got to be talking about time, energy, effort that's needed to develop and strengthen and expand that relationship. And look, the fellow that's hired to come in and watch the sheep, he doesn't really care. He's just getting paid. The text says he does not care about the sheep. So what about the shepherd? Oh, he really genuinely cares about them. It grieves him when the sheep are in trouble. So much so that he would lay down his own life. Can you imagine that? You know, it'd be much easier for us to say, okay, kill me, I'll lay down my life. But to lay down your life in the sense of taking the time, energy, effort, pre-thought, investigation, examination. See, there's laying down your life. And that's difficult. Time-consuming, emotionally and mentally draining. But it seems to me that's how these principles apply. Elders must communicate and be physically involved in leading. Look at some of these points. And this is my experience. One dumb preacher over a period of time, just observing churches where I've been. The members feel the elders, I actually had members tell me this over the years. They viewed what it means to be an elder. They go behind closed doors. They make decisions like a board of directors. They then hand down those decisions to the congregation, and that's it. A lot of members, if we took a poll of members of the church all over the brotherhood, that's probably what they'd say. That's pretty much what elders are. Somebody's got to make the decisions. That's what they do. So they're viewed as super administrators. And so what's the biggest criticism in my experience? I've heard people say that the elders don't keep us informed. They don't communicate to us. Well, why would that be a criticism? Because that's what they conceive the eldership to be. They make decisions. Now the least you can do is tell us about it. Well, they certainly need to keep members aware. They need to be leading in that. I'm not suggesting elders aren't to meet and make decisions. Obviously, they must. But that's not the extent of their responsibilities. That's really just the beginning. And I have to tell you, most of the meetings that I've sat in, I've been blessed to sit in on a lot of elders' meetings. They invited me to do so. And I've always been a little bit astounded that the majority of those meetings don't even talk about shepherding. It's all the other stuff that could easily be turned over to deacons and others, and should be. And therefore, the members tend to criticize the preachers because the members view the preacher as kind of being the elder. You didn't visit me in the hospital. I've had members say that. I know members that have left the church because the preacher didn't visit them in the hospital. So they had that expectation. The preacher's supposed to do that. I've never had anybody say the elders didn't visit me in the hospital, because they didn't expect it. The elders didn't visit them in the hospital. They didn't expect it. So the congregation can be misinformed about all of this. Well, therefore, elders have to kind of be out front. I've always thought that elders ought to make their appearance, make their presence felt, so that preachers are not allowed to overshadow in the minds of the members the status, the role of elders. It's so easy, because a preacher's up there preaching, for people to just kind of view the church as the preacher being the hub, so to speak. And that's kind of natural. I understand that, but and therefore the elders are there, but they don't really get into doing their elder stuff till they go back there and meet in the back room. See, I'm just telling you, that's how I think members conceive the whole thing. So think of ways to frustrate or get rid of that misconception. Of course, teaching is a big thing, and I know that the preachers here at this congregation over the years have really gone out of their way to stress to the membership that the elders are the leaders of this congregation, not the preachers. Preachers have a role and function to perform, but they're not the shepherds. Which leads then to this point. Elders, by definition, have to be initiators. They may use other people to do a lot of initiating, like their preachers, but they kind of have to be the mind behind all of this. And I suggested to you last night that it's easy to think that preaching and teaching and even going out and saving souls is like the ultimate role in the church. And I don't think that's the case. You could go out and baptize 500 people, and if every one of them then dropped their affiliation with Christianity, what have you accomplished? They now have to be nurtured and assisted. Their souls need to be shepherded. Well, that's the elders, not the preacher. Look at Romans 12. This concept here is repeated a time or two in the New Testament about God conceives of the church kind of like a body. He parallels it to that. He's the head, but you've got all these body parts, and that's okay. That's good. We're not all the same. We don't need to be the same. We're not assigned the same function. But all of these parts are critical, and they must be performed. We don't all have the same function, but we all have a function. And that function is critical to the ongoing operation of the body, and nobody should think that one is less than the other. They're all necessary. The older you get, guys, those of you that have had health issues, the more you realize that one little small body part, if it malfunctions, it gives you a lot of grief. The Bible's so right about that. The hand can't say to the eye, we don't need you. And that's the point here in 1 Corinthians. Many members, one body, and the body is not one member, but many. If the foot should say, I don't need the hand, does that mean that he's not part of the body and serving a crucial role? God has set the members, each one of them, in the body just as He pleased. And if they were all one member, where would the body be? So, many members, one body. The eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you. So those members of the body which we think to be less honorable, or on these we bestow greater honor. And our unpresentable parts have greater modesty. Our presentable parts have no need. Here is spiritual divine wisdom being given to us to help us think through this. My point simply being that you have these critical roles and you have to fulfill that. What if the hand or the eye is not doing what it's supposed to do? The body's hampered, it's crippled. Therefore, we need the elders. And here's the point I just mentioned about that a person's spiritual well-being after conversion is in many ways closely attached to how the elders handle that individual. Initial conversion is no more important than keeping the saved. In fact, keeping them saved is even greater. Therefore, notice, elders have to be initiators, not reactors. You don't wait until you find out, brother and sister so-and-so are getting a divorce. Well, that's a reactor. An elder must be proactive in assessing spiritual condition, take calculated, even imaginative steps to shepherd them. And then elders must be understanding and wise. This is a tough one because, how do you develop wisdom? The Bible tells us how to do it, but it takes time. Again, no doubt implying we need some age on these men. Well, look at this concept. Who is it that's wise and understanding in the church? Well, those who by their good conduct and their activity done in meekness of wisdom. That applies to all Christians, but that sure encapsulates the elders. And of course, if you want to really dig into the wisdom of the Bible, you'd go to Proverbs. And knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing. I think the Bible makes a distinction between them. Throws in the word understanding. But here is the theme of the book of Proverbs repeated again in chapter 9, but 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. You don't really start learning anything and know anything until you first respect God. Both fools despise wisdom and instruction. So he's closely aligning these, but then in chapter 9, the fear of the Lord, he uses the word wisdom in place of the word knowledge. And the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So ultimately, first and foremost, for elders to be wise men, which they are required to be an elder by definition, there has to be a close attachment to the mind of God, thinking the way God thinks to the extent that He's revealed that to us, and assimilating as much Bible as possible. You know, we think of the preacher doing that, and he must, or he'll preach error. But that doesn't exempt elders. They've got to be capable of teaching, Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3 says. And their wisdom and insight and understanding are tied into that. They're dependent upon it. So they must be understanding and wise. So, you know, you could have entire workshops just on that, couldn't you? Exploring those details. How to kind of help guys practically to assess that. And then this concept of feeding the sheep, is that not a critical feature? Again, we think, well, that's what the preacher does. Well, the elders have got to be behind that. And they've got to be monitoring. And I'm telling you, we talked last night about the apostasy that's swept across the brotherhood in the last 30 to 40 years, causing these liberal churches to be formed all over the country. Isn't that something? Right at the very time in human history and the history of the church where the church has been torn asunder, diluted, and perhaps weaker than ever before in this country. That's when our country's is unraveling. You think there's a connection? So here's denominationalism. They're of no help to the country because you know what they're doing pretty much. You know what Christianity is to them? It's coming together and entertaining themselves, you know. All that stuff. You think that's going to help anything? Remember what Paul said about that in Colossians 2? He said all of that kind of stuff, it has a show of, he uses the expression in the King James, will worship. The word there is talking about self-made religion. It's worship activity and doctrine that emanates from the minds of humans, not from God. But why would you have a Christmas candlelight service? Pass out candles at the door and let all the kids light it and everybody gets seated and, oh, it feels so good. Okay, so did that come from the mind of God or from the mind of man? And not anything in the Bible about that. In fact, candles aren't even mentioned anywhere in the Bible. So that came from the mind of man. So that's what you want your religion to be? A religion that comes from the mind of mere humans? And think of all the other stuff that Christendom has just tapped into. And then here we go now. Our own brethren fall for all that. And church after church after church across the country in the last 30 years has split and formed these groups. They're not going to be of any help in bringing some spiritual and moral sanity to the nation. And they're the very ones that God expects to do that. That makes, in my mind, that makes the Lord's church that stayed faithful congregation after congregation absolutely critical. We're going to have a lot to answer for. Whether we've stood up at this critical time, this juncture in American history, and exerted as much positive influence as we possibly can for the Lord. Leave it to Him to deal with all of the people that reject it. But we need to be that light. And can you not see that the backbone of the church is the elders to do that? We can do it. All right, the elders may turn over a lot of things to teachers and preachers. That's fine. But they can't turn it over in the sense that, okay, I'm trusting you to do that and I'm not going to monitor you. You can't do that because the buck stops with the elders. They are the ones that feed the sheep. So they're going to be careful who they hire. The point I was going to make about all this apostasy over the last 30 years, it was pretty much orchestrated by preachers. Right? Think of the big names, across our brotherhood. I don't mean to call name, but Rubel Shelley and Max, okay, a whole bunch of these guys. They were major fomenters, major leaders in carrying the church off into denominationalism and apostasy. So the question is, where were the elders in each one of those churches? Well, I know a lot of elders that stood strong and were run off But it was always a situation where some of the elders sided with this charismatic, fun-loving preacher that they just loved to be around. They fell for it. They drank the Kool-Aid. So at the end of time, are those preachers going to give account to God? Absolutely. But the elders behind them are really going to give account. To allow God's flock to be attacked by, who did we see in Acts 20 last night? Ravenous, vicious wolves. And God's going to say, you let my flock be ravaged? I mean, put in the teeth of wolves and chomped down on. Don't you think that's how that's going to go down in eternity? Oh, the sheep are going to give account for falling for it. Everybody's responsible for their own actions. But God wants those elders to be on guard against that. I mean, one comment by a preacher in a class can start it. I'm not so sure that the Bible actually condemns instrumental music. And even if it does, I don't believe you'll be lost over that. And then moves on to something else, never brings that up again. And there it goes. You know, there was a teacher at Freed that was doing that a number of years ago. Got in a good president that eliminated him real quick. That needed to be done. But boy, those students that had fallen for that stuff, they were not happy that he was eliminated. They didn't even perceive the danger. See, in fact, they agreed with the teacher because he was a charismatic guy and he taught them that and they thought it must be true. Elders have got to be on top of that. Love their preachers enough to monitor them and help them to not get off track. And if they find out that a preacher is stubborn and obstinate and has an agenda, see, how does an eldership sniff out an agenda? Do you not see that a lot of our politicians and leaders in our country have an agenda? They do. And I believe the bulk of our society is oblivious to it. They don't see it. Well, God knew that. So He wants the elders to be savvy, insightful fellows that can see that. And even if the members are upset, you fired our preacher? See, there's got to be a relationship there where they trust that the elders do what they were doing. And maybe then you should go ahead and communicate more information. Sometimes we're too concerned about being delicate and not divulging things to people. Maybe we ought to be more open about it because they don't perceive the danger. They need to wake up and grow enough to perceive the danger and then respect their elders for having the gumption to stand up and do what needed to be done, even though it's unpleasant, distasteful. How well do we monitor what Bible class teachers are doing? You know, most of the churches I've been in, you're struggling just to get somebody to teach a Bible class. Will you please take the 5-year-olds, you know? Well, okay. And by the way, usually the older folks, like the older women that ought to be doing it, say, oh, I paid my dues back then. I don't want to do that now. Well, they need a talking to. The older and wiser and more experienced and knowledgeable you are, the more we need you in the teaching work of the church. What are you thinking? You can't retire from this. Got to make sure that there are not seeds being sown that are destructive to souls. How do you know? How does an elder know that the members are being nourished? You know, we gave them the right curriculum, the right Bible material. We put teachers in there. How do you know if you have any sickly sheep that are not getting it? Well, you've got to take steps to determine that, find that out. Hebrews 13:17. Obey those who rule over you, be submissive. If I were to summarize the role of an elder, this stands out in my mind more than any of these other passages because it really gets to the nub of it, the heart of it here. What do elders do? Who are they? What's the thrust of their role and responsibilities? They watch for souls. That covers a lot of things, but it gets to it. Oh, you mean I'm supposed to be watching for their individual soul in such a way that I have an effect on how that soul turns out and how it ultimately thrives or doesn't thrive? Well, it comes back to that concept. You've got to watch out for them and do what needs to be done. Well, may God bless all of you that are shepherds. As you look to the future of your congregation, be thinking about that. What's coming down the pike here? What's the current status of the church, the membership? What can we anticipate here, and what should we be doing to prepare? Stay tuned. You know, the Church of Christ, I think, have properly emphasized what the Bible emphasizes, that it all revolves around Christ and His truth. You know, one of the things that the liberal element did was they shifted and said, oh, you know, we need to focus on Jesus, not a book, which was completely nonsensical, anti-biblical. So the emphasis in churches of Christ historically has been, man, you've got to get the truth out there into people's hearts. So we've got to maintain that focus. Are we doing that? Guard against wolves entering. Be on the alert, be on the watch. Nip it quickly when you see the potential for that happening. Build up the church. God said, you remember this is a chapter on the shepherds of Israel. You're men, and I'm your God. They're part of the flock too, but they also have this special function of being shepherds. Let's close with the one statement that Paul makes, where he says concerning shepherds, as those who must give account. That too is a frightening statement to me. I mean, we're all going to give account for our souls and our behavior. But elders have that added layer. They're going to give account for the souls of the sheep that were committed to their charge. That's awesome. It's frightening. Maybe it ought to be motivational. This is a reason for me. I better go check on these people because I'm going to give account. I didn't mean to leave the impression last night when I mentioned Bill Cosby, who said, you know, I've seen the job of child rearing and what my wife has to go through, and I don't want the job. I didn't mean to leave the impression that you should only reluctantly take up the role of an elder. Maybe it ought to be reluctant, but it's got to be done. And God, don't you know that God is just waiting and anticipating and wanting men to step up to the plate and serve in this crucial, critical role for such a time as this? And I can't imagine that any man feels adequate to the job, so don't let that be the determination. Ought to have an humble, gentle heart that realizes your own frailties and yet sees the need. God wants men to stand up, protect the flock, guard the flock, nurture the flock, and be willing to shoulder that responsibility. Well, I don't know whether or not that's been of encouragement to you. I sure haven't intended to discourage you. But let me close by saying we can do this. We can and we must. We must do it. You know, as men, God's placed so much responsibility on us. That too, see, is an intimidating responsibility. And we men have kind of been shirking that from the beginning. Remember, whenever Eve launched out there, stepped out of her properly assigned role and tried to take the lead, then turns around and implicates him and gets him to go right along with her. That's been pretty typical of human history. And then God confronts not her, but him. And his response is, well, she's the problem. You gave her to me. See, that's men passing the buck. Can't do that. I mean, the Bible, with all feminism and everything else that's happened in our country to distort Bible teaching, the Bible clearly teaches that men are to be the head of the home and to be the leaders in the church. And interestingly enough, women are very willing to shoulder those roles. Now, they just are. If they don't understand that all of their talents and abilities and initiative is great, it's good, God built it into them. They were designed for man. But if they don't understand how that's to be manifested, they will overshadow the role of men, and men are perfectly free to say back, hey, no problem, I'll go fishing. So it takes guts, it takes manliness to take on these roles that God's assigned to us as males. So all this attack on gender is an attack on God and His Word. Because He created gender, and as males, we've got awesome, heavy responsibilities. May we not shirk from them, be fearful of them, run from them, but courageously try as best we can to fulfill them. And I pray, God, that you might do that. Will you pause just a moment? Let's pray, and then we'll turn it over to Dan.